Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Yongnuo 23mm F1.4. Now, this is the second in the Direct Commander series that I'm reviewing right now. I recently did the first in that series, which is the 33mm F1.4, though that was a follow-up to an 11mm F1.8 that they released earlier in 2024. The Commander series is all around, designed around the premise of having kind of these premium lenses in the APS-C space with relatively fast maximum apertures of f1.4, but the ability to introduce some wireless control into the lens by using an optional adapter like this. That's where the Commander portion of the name comes in. Now, as noted, this is the second entry in the Commander series, and so first of all, I looked at a 33mm f1.4. Today we're looking at a 23mm f1.4, and then the third lens to be released in the series will be a 56mm f1.4. Now, because of the crop factor of the cameras that these are forward, which is typically 1.5 times, that means we're roughly looking at a 35mm, a 50mm, and an 85mm lens in terms of full frame equivalent. So your typical trinity of fast prime lenses. Now, today I'm going to be reviewing on Sony E-mount. I'm actually filming with the lens at the moment. I realized when I got to my studio space that I hadn't brought another lens for filming. So as a byproduct, it's going to be filmed on the lens itself. But there's also a Nikon Z and Fuji X-mount version as well. Now, we're going to find that this is an incredibly feature-rich lens, like the 33mm f1.4 before, with a similar price point of right under $270. So it's going to be a very compelling option if you happen to be looking for a fast, moderately wide angle prime lens for your APS-C camera. So we're going to dive into all of the details after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is sponsored by the Fantom Tracker. Are you someone prone to misplacing your wallet or bag? If so, the Fantom Tracker card is definitely for you. This credit card size tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and functions like an Apple AirTag. It can be locally tracked via a 95 decibel beeping noise that can be heard up to 300 feet away, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My network and its map. Unlike many other trackers, the Fantom Tracker card has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge will last up to 6 months. The low price of the Fantom Tracker makes it a perfect gift, and you can save even more by visiting store.fantomwallet.com and using code DUSTIN20 at checkout. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code DUSTIN20 for 20% off.
So let's start by taking a look at the build and the handling and the various features included in this lens. So as mentioned, this is a 23mm lens, so when you use the 1.5 times crop factor on Sony or Fuji or Nikon, it comes out to 34.5mm, and so basically a 35mm full frame equivalent lens. Now, the full name of this lens, as tends to be the case with Yongnuo's lenses, is fairly wordy. It's a 23mm f1.4 SDA DSM WL Pro. They kind of follow the same strategy as what Fuji does, in that they really kind of give you a feature list to some degree in the name itself. So to break that down, f1.4S, the S refers to Sony or Sony E-mount. DA refers to the fact that this is an APS-C lens. DSM refers to a digital stepping motor, which is the focus system here. WL means that it has the wireless control, as mentioned. And then Pro means that it is their kind of upscale line with better build and additional features than the non-Pro series lenses. Now, because you're getting both a fast maximum aperture and a lot of features, more so than what any of the competition has, this is a fairly heavy lens for the class. It's about 360 grams or 13 ounces. However, if I look at a lens like Fuji's 23mm f1.4, it is 375 grams, so about 15 grams heavier. The other kind of main competitor would be the Sigma 23mm f1.4, and it's 340 grams, so only 20 grams less. That puts this Yongnuo lens basically right in between those two. And so I would say that for having as much features as it does, that's kind of an appropriate space for the lens itself. Now, the lens is 69 millimeters in diameter, or 2.7 inches, 87 millimeters in length, 3.4 inches, and there is a common 58 millimeter front filter thread that will be shared across all three of these lenses, all of which will be roughly the same size and within a few grams of each other in terms of weight. Now, you will note if you look at the front of this lens that you'll see something there you don't often see, and that's the Wi-Fi logo. And that reflects the fact that this can be, in the Commander series, can be remotely controlled. And so Wi-Fi is built into the lens itself and the ability to do kind of an ad hoc direct connection there. The aperture is very robust in terms of the feature set. You have the ability to either click or de-click it, and so that's always a very nice feature to have. You have the ability, obviously, to put it in the automatic mode if you want to control within camera. It has a function button that you can apply different functions to, program from within the camera. There is a custom switch there as well, and so that can accomplish a couple of things. It can serve just as a basic AF/MF switch if you're not really wanting to mess with the wireless control. However, it's also the means by which you can put it into the mode by which it can be remotely controlled via this little remote right here. By the way, this remote is going to be compatible with any of these lenses. You don't have to have one for each lens, very obviously. Price tag is going to be around $25 or so to purchase this, but once you have it, it gives you the ability to, for example, do focus pulls. You could change it to where you're controlling aperture through the wheel here. It has buttons to where you can do A/B focus pulls, and so if you want to program a preset focus position and a second position, you can just click and automatically move between those two focus positions. So it definitely gives you some versatility in how you control that. The aperture iris itself has 9 rounded blades with a reasonably but not exceptionally circular aperture size. It does have a port for doing firmware updates, so a USB-C port. Now, it is, with all of these lenses, it is located near the mount of the lens, but on the side of the lens, and there's a little rubber gasket that fits very tightly that you need to pry out before you can access that USB-C port. I would prefer that the port itself was just weather sealed, or just put it on the actual lens mount like Viltrox does, for example. The reason for that is twofold. First of all, it is, as noted, it's very hard to pry that out. And if you don't have like long fingernails, which few men do, then you happen to be male, well, you're gonna have a hard time prying that out with just a fingernail. I tend to use like a thin bladed screwdriver, for example, to pry that off. But once that gasket pops out, it's quite small, it's black, it'd be pretty easy to lose it somewhere. And then of course you have an opening in your lens where it's no longer fully weather sealed, because this is a weather sealed lens. It does have a gasket at the rear of the lens, fluorine coating on the front element, and some internal seals inside. And so you certainly wouldn't want to compromise that weather sealing. At the same time, I do appreciate having the USB-C port, not with this lens, but with the 33mm. It did need a firmware update to ensure full and proper compatibility with the camera body. And so being able to do those firmware updates quickly and easily is great. Now, thus far, I've not been particularly impressed with the minimum focus distance of this particular lens or this series in general. And so in this case, we have a minimum focus distance of 30 centimeters. And just kind of as your rule of thumb, if your minimum focus distance is roughly corresponding to your focal length or longer than it, means that your magnification is not going to be very good. If it is considerably shorter than the focal length, then there's a good chance you're going to have a decent amount of magnification. So using that particular equation, you may have figured out that this is not great. And so you're going to get at best about a 0.10 times level of magnification, which is quite low. Overall, however, this is a very feature-rich lens. It's got a lot to offer, and so I think it exceeds any of the lenses in this class that I've reviewed. And so for the amount of money that you're paying, you're getting a lot of value there in terms of the feature set, which really isn't all that far off what you might find on a Sony G-Master type lens, for example. So let's talk about autofocus for stills here initially. As mentioned, that it has a DSM or a digital stepping motor. I'm not really sure what the difference between a digital stepping motor and just a stepping motor is, but it's a decent focus motor here. Autofocus for stills is good. It's fast, it's quiet, it's accurate. I used it while traveling to Arizona recently, and I shot in a variety of situations, and I can't recall any kind of issue where I felt like autofocus wasn't serving me well. And so I could lock onto human subjects, onto animal subjects without issue, and get very accurately focused results. And so no problems there in all the various situations that I shot in. Autofocus just did the job, and without any kind of drama, without drawing any kind of attention to itself. And so great great marks when it comes to stills autofocus. On the video side of things, also, I would say I have very positive results to report. The video focus pulls, as you can see here, are good. There's not visible steps, there's not pulsing, but it's going from one subject to another and locking on with a good degree of confidence. You will note some focus breathing there, but not too bad. Likewise, when I did my hand test, you can see here that it transitioned from my hand to my eye, back to the hand fairly well without any kind of pulsing or any drama there. And so in general, my video autofocus was good. No complaints over that as well. And so again, for an inexpensive lens and from a company that's not been doing autofocus for decades at this point, I'm pretty impressed by the state of autofocus on these inexpensive lenses from Yongnuo at this point. So how about a look at the optics? I'm going to give you an overview here and then we'll give you a breakdown at the end of the video if you want a deeper dive into the optical performance. We have an optical design here of 11 elements in 9 groups. That includes well more than half of those are exotic elements, including 3 extra low dispersion elements and then 4 high refractive index elements. So great to have, good quality glass that is in there. I found when taking a look at the MTF versus what I saw from the 33mm lens, the MTF looks a little bit better here with this 23mm lens. And so it's going to be a little bit sharper with a little bit better contrast across the frame. However, it does share the same kind of basic optical issue with the 33mm lens, and that is that there is a fair amount of fringing in certain situations. It's not extreme enough that you're going to just see it in images when you're looking at the full image, but very likely if you are zooming into 100% magnification, you're going to definitely see it in certain kind of high contrast situations. Now, for those of you that are interested in seeing whether or not this can cover the full frame image circle, the short answer is no. There is a good portion of that image frame that has a hard mechanical vignette where there's nothing recoverable, no light is reaching the sensor at that portion. And what I found is if I took that image and then I cropped in, I maybe got a millimeter and a half of additional coverage, certainly not worth considering. And so as per usual, I recommend that if you want a full frame lens, buy a full frame lens and don't try to use a lens like this to do that. When it comes to the vignette and distortion, what I found is that there was a little bit more barrel distortion, a +12 to correct for it, but there was less vignette with only a +32 to correct that relative to the 33mm lens. Neither one of these things was huge factors, even though the barrel distortion was very slightly complex. It corrected well enough that there's probably very few real world scenarios where you would notice it after correction. I did find that in doing my chart test that even at 200% magnification, which is how I look at this, by the way, I'm testing at a 26 megapixel level on Sony. If you're testing on the 40 megapixel level on Fuji, or that's your camera, you're probably going to see a little bit less apparent sharpness than what you're going to see here. If you're using the Fuji 26 megapixel sensor or something similar from Nikon, then you're going to see roughly similar results to what I am finding here. So what I found is that there was, good sharpness, wide open, good contrast, though not extremely good. And so, kind of about probably very slightly better than average overall, but not bad for f1.4 and an inexpensive lens. You can see in this comparison to the 33mm lens that on my chart test, as the MTF suggested, the results are definitely sharper there. I did find that there is a little bit of boost by f1.8, but a more noticeable increase of contrast by f2. I found that when stopping down to f2.8, by that point the corners were starting to get very sharp, and at landscape apertures from f4 to f8, I found that it was nicely sharp all across the frame. Even at smaller apertures, f11 and f16, which is the minimum aperture, I found that the diffraction was there and I could see it, but it was relatively mild on Sony. It will be a little bit more obvious when you're looking at the 40 megapixel sensor on Fuji, however. The bokeh quality here is overall, I would say it is quite nice. It's not exceptionally nice. It's not like the Viltrox Pro 27mm F1.2, which is really, really gorgeous bokeh. This is, kind of the average good of these lenses and this particular class of lens. It's nice enough in most images that I don't find it objectionable at all, but neither do I look at images and just say, oh wow, that's just a really gorgeous, creamy rendering either. I found that flare resistance was fairly good in most situations. I did shoot quite a bit while hiking into very bright sun in Arizona, and I found that overall the flare resistance was good. There was a few angles where I could see a little bit of a light leak, maybe down in the left corner, or a little bit of ghosting artifacts. But the biggest thing that actually stood out to me is that when you stop the lens down, the sun stars actually get really, really strong. I would argue maybe a little bit too strong. The blades really can kind of dominate in there. And so if you're shooting that kind of shot with, like as I did with the sun in the frame, shooting more like f5.6 is actually, to me, a better result. You still get a sun star effect, but it doesn't just stretch across the majority of the frame. And so overall, I would say that while their optical glass isn't top tier, colors looked okay. I liked images just fine. And I actually generally enjoyed shooting with the lens. And so that says a lot for a budget lens that is well under $300. And that is really where my conclusion comes to. I'm pretty amazed at how good budget lenses are these days. Again, I reflect back to the fact that in 2016, I reviewed the Rokinon 21mm F1.4. And so, fairly close to this lens in focal length, same maximum aperture. That lens was manual only. It had zero features. It had a aperture ring and a focus ring. That's all it had, no electronics. And so here we have a lens that is higher performing. It has autofocus, it has all kinds of features, it's got weather sealing, all of these things, and it actually, instead of costing more, cost $180 less. That is just remarkable about how competitive budget lenses have gotten during that period. And so really you're getting pretty much a GM feature set, good autofocus, and a fairly strong optical performance, all for about $270. I would call us very fortunate to live in the era we do when it comes to photography. So the Yongnuo 23mm F1.4, all those letters after it, it's a pretty great consideration if you're looking for a 35mm-ish type lens for your APS-C camera. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want more information, you can check out either my thorough text review, which is linked in the description down below. There's an image gallery there as well. And if you want a deeper dive into the optics, stick with me right now, and let's jump into that together.
Okay, let's take a look starting at vignette and distortion. So you can see here that there is some barrel distortion here. I used a +12 to correct. You can see there's a tiny bit of bulge. This is about as much as I could go without starting to cause a little bit of inversion in the corners. And so it's not completely linear, but neither is it very bad. And you probably wouldn't notice this on anything but a chart with lines like this. You can also see that vignette is quite mild. Now this is a good thing because I don't know that you'll always get profile support in camera with Yongnuo lenses. So the fact that this is only about a stop of vignette in the corners, very easily correctable, but you can get away with not correcting it either. As noted previously, there definitely is some longitudinal style chromatic aberrations, and that's kind of the weak point for this whole series so far. You can see some magenta before, but more noticeably the green fringing afterward. You can see it here as well on these shiny reflective surfaces, and again, it's mostly in the form of the green fringing. Before the plane of focus, and there's not a lot in this shot before, but you can see a little bit of the magenta there, but it's mostly the green that you're going to encounter. Now, when it comes to lateral style chromatic aberrations, not too bad here. You can see a tiny amount here, but nothing that's really going to mess up real-world images. This is a much higher magnification than what anyone would typically look at their images. Now, just to revisit for a moment the full frame image circle coverage, so you can see that definitely a good portion of the full frame image circle is not covered. And when I cropped in, I mean, if you eliminate that, down to about this point, you're only adding on about 2 millimeters of extra width on there. Certainly not worth messing with. So for our resolution and contrast, we'll be looking at the chart and at 26 megapixels on Sony, and this is at 200% magnification. Center of the frame, you can see result looks good. I mean, not off the charts good, but good contrast, relatively good detail, no real complaints there. Mid frame also looking really nice and strong. Down into the corners are not bad. You can tell they're not quite as sharp, but looking pretty good overall. If we pop up the other direction, about the same mid-frame result. Upper left corner looks actually quite good, and down here into the lower left corner, a pretty consistent result, not bad in terms of centering. Now, at a less critical 100% magnification with some real-world images, you can see that that's really a beautiful amount of contrast and resolution there. Like, that looks really, really nice. You can see great delineation and all of the various eyelashes there. A very, very nice result. Here's another shot, f1.4, and you can see good detail and contrast. I mean, plenty for shooting portraits or whatever you might be doing with a lens like this. So a really nice looking result. Now, if you go from f1.4 to f1.8, you'll notice a little bit of contrast uptick there, a little bit sharper results, but not a radical difference. Stopping on down to f2 gives a little bit more punch there, and so a more obvious boost in the corners. You can see definitely looking brighter, better contrast there, and detail is starting to look better overall. The shot of Ferrari at f2, if I punch in to 100% magnification, you can see that looks really, really crisp and nicely detailed. Great contrast there. You can see a little bit of fringing that remains at f2, but obviously, again, if I hadn't drawn your attention to it, there's probably a fairly low chance you actually picked up on that or would consider that to be ruinous to the image. By f2.8, our corners are starting to look crisper here. By f4, looking better still. And by f5.6, looking really quite good. You can see at a real-world image, looking at 100% magnification, center of the frame, you can see just great detail and all of that deep draw distance. It all looks very good. And even if we pan over here towards the corners right off into the extreme corners are still looking quite good. Lots of detail everywhere I look inside the frame. Now, diffraction is going to be a factor on Sony at 26 megapixels. It's going to be more obvious if you're shooting on the Fuji 40 megapixel body, but you can see here f11 is still looking quite good. It's a little softer at f16. You can see it's just not as crisply delineated, but not a huge drop off either. So I wouldn't worry about diffraction too much unless you're shooting on one of the really high resolution bodies. Now, we've noted that the level of magnification isn't super high. Fortunately, the performance, even at f1.4 up close, is really quite good. You can see really good detail and contrast everywhere in the frame. So that's your trade-off. It can't focus super close, but what it does very nicely. So how about bokeh? This is an interesting comparison right here because you can see on the one on the left, it's the same scene, just a slightly different composition, same maximum aperture of f1.4. In this case, I was a little bit lower, and so the background is further away. Looks pretty soft and creamy. On the right side, I shot from a little bit higher angle, eliminating more of the background. It also just means that there's more in the transition zone, and you can see that this image, by comparison, is considerably more busy, and so it has a lot to do with what's in or not in the transition zone. Here's a shot with some specular highlights. So first of all, detail and contrast looks good. Specular highlights, your biggest negative is going to be some green fringing around the outside of those. So that is going to impact things. You can see near the corners going to be a little bit of cat eye effect. The bokeh here, it looks okay. I do see a little bit more outlining than what I would like, but again, the image doesn't look too bad. This image without any specular highlights, even though there are some various edges that are possible here, I actually quite like this image, and maybe it's just the color palette that appeals to my eye, but the image itself, I think the bokeh holds up quite well here. And this is another shot that I wanted to show two things here. First of all, I think that this one holds up pretty well as far as the transition to defocus. I also point out that in this case, I think that the colors look good. You know, here, I think the colors look really great here. It helps that there's great contrast in the image, but saturation levels look nice. I don't always find the blues. The blues to me can be just a little bit kind of oversaturated, or just something about them that I don't love as well with Yongnuo's glass, but in general, I was happy with the images that I got. Now, finally, let's talk a little bit about the flare resistance. So first of all, as noted, you can get some really dominant, this is f11, you can get some really dominant sun stars because those blades reach so far out. Now, if you love that, then great. I find it a little too dominant for my taste. If the sun is right out of frame, you'll get a ghosting artifact that kind of looks more like a light leak, as you can see here, but you can also see that contrast is held up fine in the image. Likewise here, obviously the sun is right in the frame, very intense, but only a little ghosting artifact here, and if we punch in here, we can see that contrast is really holding up well. I guess there's a little ghosting artifact right there, but there's nothing really destructive to the image, and so I think that this is a pretty acceptable amount of flare resistance. Overall, I was not displeased.
Well, thanks for sticking around to the very end, and I hope that the deep dive into the optical performance has answered whatever lingering questions you have about the Yongnuo 23mm F1.4. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.